I knew he wouldn't resist. That thought echoed in my mind as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, wrapped in nothing but a towel clinging to my hips. My skin still glistened from the hot shower, steam swirling around me like a secret. I could feel it, his eyes on me. Even when he thought I wasn't paying attention, I saw the way his gaze lingered, just a second too long, on places it shouldn't. His name was Garrett. The perfect husband for my mom, or so everyone thought. He was 20 years older than me, with that salt and pepper hair that women swooned over, a strong jawline, and those piercing blue eyes that always seemed to see more than they should. He was the kind of man who carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that made you wonder what he was thinking behind that composed exterior. But I knew what was behind those eyes. Mom had left for a week-long business trip, leaving just the two of us alone in the house. And that's when it all began. I'd noticed his stares before, those fleeting glances when he thought no one was looking. But now, with Mom gone, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. At first, it was just a game. Short shorts, thin tank tops without a bra, accidental brushes when we passed each other in the hall. Harmless, right? But the more I saw him struggle to keep his composure, the more I felt this rush, this power. It was intoxicating. That night, I decided to push things further. I left the bathroom door slightly ajar, just enough for someone walking by to catch a glimpse. Wrapped in a towel, my hair damp, I pretended not to hear his footsteps echoing down the hall. But my heart raced as I saw his shadow pause just outside the door. He was watching. I knew he was watching. The next morning, everything seemed normal on the surface. Garrett sat at the kitchen table, reading the paper like he always did. But I noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, how he wouldn't meet my eyes when I walked in, wearing nothing but an oversized t-shirt that barely covered the tops of my thighs. I poured myself a glass of orange juice, feeling his gaze flicker up for just a second before he quickly looked away. I smiled to myself. This was too easy. By the afternoon, the tension was unbearable. We danced around each other like two magnets, pulled together by something neither of us wanted to admit. I'd catch him watching me from the corner of his eye when he thought I wasn't looking. And every time our hands brushed, whether reaching for a dish or passing in the hallway, I felt that electric spark. That evening, I took it to the next level. I waited until he settled into the living room, flipping through channels like he always did after dinner. I walked in, fresh out of the shower, towel barely hanging on, pretending to search for something on the coffee table. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my skin. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he finally asked, his voice rougher than usual. I turned to him, letting the towel slip just a bit lower on my hip. "Not yet," I said, holding his gaze a little too long before turning and walking out of the room. I knew I was playing with fire, but the thrill of it? It was impossible to resist. The next day, I decided to invite my best friend Savannah over. I wanted to see if Garrett would behave differently with someone else around. Savannah and I lounged by the pool, laughing and sipping iced tea, and I could feel his eyes from the kitchen window, watching us as we tanned in our bikinis. When Savannah went inside to use the bathroom, I followed her a few minutes later, pretending I needed a drink. Garrett was in the kitchen, his back turned to me, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. "Enjoying the view?" I teased, my voice low, almost a whisper. He stiffened, but didn't turn around. "Be careful," he muttered. "You don't know what you're doing." But I did know. I knew exactly what I was doing. That night, after Savannah left, the house felt even quieter than usual. I waited until I heard Garrett head upstairs to his bedroom before I made my move. I crept down the hall, my towel barely covering me, and paused outside his door. I could hear him moving around inside. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but the adrenaline pushed me forward. I lightly tapped on the door. "Garrett?" I called softly. There was a pause, then his voice, tight and controlled. "Yeah, I can't sleep," I lied, biting my lip. "Can I come in for a minute?" The door creaked open slowly, and there he was. His eyes darkened when he saw me standing there, vulnerable, or at least, pretending to be. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice a mix of confusion and something else, something darker. I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. I thought maybe we could talk." For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. The tension between us was suffocating. "You need to go to bed," he finally said, his voice strained. But I didn't move. I took a step closer, close enough to smell his cologne, that familiar mix of cedar and musk that always lingered in the hall after he passed by. "Do you want me to leave?" I whispered. His jaw clenched. His eyes flickered down to the towel, then back up to my face. I said, "Go to bed." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before turning and walking out, my heart racing. I could feel his eyes on me as I disappeared down the hall. I thought I was in control. I thought I was winning. But what happened next, I never saw coming. You won't believe how this story ends. And trust me, it only gets crazier from here. The next morning, Garrett pretended like nothing had happened. But I could see right through him. His movements were too stiff, too controlled. His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself coffee, and he kept his eyes glued to the newspaper, refusing to meet my gaze. I sat down across from him at the breakfast table, wearing nothing but a loose tank top and a pair of shorts that barely covered anything. I stirred my cereal slowly, feeling his tension grow with every second. "Sleep well?" I asked, my voice light, casual. He cleared his throat, still not looking up. "Fine." I smirked, letting the silence stretch between us. He was unraveling, little by little, and I wasn't going to stop until he snapped. By mid-afternoon, I decided to turn up the heat. I texted my best friend Savannah, inviting her over for the evening. She was the kind of girl who attracted attention wherever she went, blonde, tall, with a laugh that filled the room. But tonight, the attention wouldn't be on her. When she arrived, we sprawled out on the back patio with a couple of iced teas, the summer sun beating down on our skin. I wore my tiniest bikini, one I knew left little to the imagination. Savannah, oblivious to my game, chattered away about some guy she'd met at a party. But my focus was on the kitchen window. I knew he was watching. Sure enough, I caught a glimpse of him through the glass, pretending to busy himself with dishes but stealing glances in our direction. I leaned back in my chair, arching my back just enough to make my chest more prominent, laughing at something Savannah said, though I barely heard her words. After a while, Savannah excused herself to use the bathroom. The moment she disappeared inside, I followed, my heart pounding with anticipation. Garrett was in the kitchen, rinsing a glass. He didn't notice me at first, but when he turned around and saw me standing there, wet hair, sun-kissed skin, bikini barely holding on, his eyes darkened for a split second before he quickly looked away. "Enjoying the view?" I teased, my voice soft, playful. His jaw clenched. "Be careful," he muttered, his voice low. "You don't know what you're doing." I took a slow step closer, my bare feet silent against the tile. "Oh, I think I do." He turned sharply, his eyes finally locking onto mine. There was something dangerous in his gaze now, something that sent a shiver down my spine, not fear, but excitement. "Stop," he said firmly, but his voice wavered just enough for me to know he didn't mean it. Before I could respond, Savannah's voice echoed down the hall, and the spell was broken. Garrett turned back to the sink, his shoulders tense, while I sauntered back outside, my pulse racing. When Savannah finally left that evening, the house felt heavier, the air thick with everything unsaid. I left my empty wine glass on the coffee table and headed upstairs, making sure to sway my hips just a little more than usual. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into my back as I disappeared down the hall. Once in my room, I closed the door, but not all the way. I left it slightly ajar, just enough. And then, I waited. Minutes passed. My heart pounded in my chest, every sound in the house amplified by the silence. I heard him moving around downstairs, the clink of dishes, the soft hum of the TV. But then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs. I held my breath. The steps stopped right outside my door. I could hear him breathing, could feel him standing there, just on the other side. My pulse raced as I imagined him reaching for the handle, pushing the door open, stepping inside. But he didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I heard his bedroom door close down the hall, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I couldn't stop the smile from creeping onto my face. He was cracking. It was only a matter of time. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. Garrett had left early for work, and the space felt strange without him. I wandered downstairs, still in my pajama shorts and a loose crop top, replaying last night over and over in my head. I thought about the way his eyes darkened when he looked at me, the way his voice trembled when he told me to be careful. I thought about how close we were to the edge, and I wanted to push him over. Later that afternoon, I decided to make dinner, something simple, but enough to lure him into a false sense of normalcy. I wanted him comfortable. Just before I twisted the knife, I wore a soft, silky dress that clung to all the right places. No bra, of course. The fabric brushed against my skin with every movement, a constant reminder of the game I was playing. When Garrett came home, he paused in the doorway, his eyes flickering over me before quickly looking away. "I made dinner," I said, smiling sweetly. thought it'd be nice since it's just us." He didn't respond, just set down his keys and moved past me, his body stiff as a board. But I saw the way his eyes lingered, just for a moment, on the curve of my back as I turned towards the stove. Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. The clink of forks against plates echoed in the stillness. I could feel his eyes on me, even when he wasn't looking directly. After we ate, I poured us both a glass of wine. He hesitated, but I handed it to him anyway, our fingers brushing as he took the glass. "To a quiet evening," I said, raising my glass with a small, knowing smile. He stared at me for a moment, his eyes unreadable, before clinking his glass against mine. We sat in the living room afterward, the tension thick enough to suffocate. I perched on the edge of the couch, legs crossed, the hem of my dress sliding dangerously high on my thigh. Garrett sat rigid in his chair across from me, pretending to focus on the TV. But I knew better. I let the silence stretch, sipping my wine slowly, watching him from the corner of my eye. Finally, I stood, pretending to stretch, and let out a soft sigh. "I think I'm gonna take a bath," I said casually, setting my glass down. I walked past him, letting my hand lightly brush his shoulder as I did. I didn't look back, but I could feel him watching me as I climbed the stairs. Back in my room, I left the door open just enough, the soft glow of the hallway light spilling inside. I let the towel fall to the floor as I slipped into my robe, deliberately loose, the fabric gaping slightly at the front. I sat at my vanity, brushing my damp hair, waiting. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, hesitant. They stopped outside my door again. My heart pounded in my chest. This time, I knew he wouldn't just walk away. Seconds stretched into eternity. But then, nothing. The footsteps retreated, and I heard his bedroom door close once more. I stared at my reflection, my chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He was fighting it. But for how much longer? I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The looks, the touches, the near misses. We were dancing on the edge of something dangerous, something I couldn't walk away from. And neither could he. What happened next would change everything. And I wasn't ready for it. But it was coming. By the third day, things had shifted. Garrett wasn't just avoiding eye contact anymore. He was avoiding me. He started leaving for work earlier, coming home later, and when he was in the house, he stayed locked in his office or buried himself in the garage. But no matter how much he tried to hide, every time our paths crossed, I could see it. That tension, the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes flickered down to my lips and then darted away like he'd been burned. He was losing the battle, and I was ready to push him over the edge. That evening, I decided to set the trap. I spent the afternoon preparing dinner, not because I cared about the meal, but because I wanted to create the perfect scene. I lit a couple of candles, dimmed the lights just enough, and pulled out the bottle of red wine Mom had been saving for a special occasion. But the piece de resistance? The dress. It was strapless, clinging to my curves, barely covering what needed to be covered. Every step I took, it rode up just a little higher, threatening to reveal more. No bra, of course. Just the soft fabric against my skin, reminding me of the game I was playing. When I heard the garage door open, my heart skipped a beat. I took a deep breath, adjusted the neckline of my dress just enough to make it look like it had accidentally slipped down, and poured 2 glasses of wine. The front door creaked open, and Garrett's heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. I heard him drop his keys on the table, the sound of his jacket being shrugged off, then silence. I knew he was standing there, just out of sight, sensing that something was different. Finally, he stepped into the kitchen. Our eyes met. For a second, he froze in the doorway. His gaze flickered over me, my bare shoulders, the curve of my waist, the glass of wine in my hand. His lips parted slightly like he was about to say something, but no words came out. I decided to do something special, I said softly, my voice light, almost innocent. Since Mom's not here. I watched as his throat bobbed, his Adam's apple rising and falling as he swallowed hard. But he said nothing, just nodded stiffly and moved to sit at the table. Dinner was silent. The only sounds were the clink of silverware against plates and the soft hum of music I'd put on in the background, something slow and smooth, like the tension simmering between us. I could feel his gaze on me, even when he wasn't looking directly. Every time our hands brushed as I passed him a dish, a jolt of electricity shot through me. I let my foot slide under the table, just barely grazing his leg. He stiffened immediately, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the contact linger, my toes tracing a slow, deliberate path up his calf. He cleared his throat, dropping his fork with a soft clatter. I'm done, he muttered, standing abruptly. But I wasn't going to let him escape that easily. As he moved to leave the room, I stood too, catching his arm gently but firmly. He froze, his muscles tensing under my touch. Garrett, I whispered, stepping closer, closing the distance between us. Don't you feel it? His breath hitched, his eyes finally meeting mine. And there it was, the storm behind them. Confusion, guilt, desire all swirling together in a way that made my heart race. There's nothing to feel, he said, but his voice was hoarse, unconvincing. I leaned in, my lips inches from his ear. You sure about that? For a split second, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, without a word, he yanked his arm free and stormed out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared down the hall. The sound of his bedroom door slamming shut echoed through the house. I stood there for a moment, my pulse racing in my chest. I should have felt frustrated. I should have been angry that he'd walked away again. But instead, I smiled, because he was breaking, and it was only a matter of time before he shattered completely. The next morning, the house felt colder, quieter. Garrett had left early, as usual, but there was something different in the air, a tension that clung to the walls like humidity before a storm. I spent the day replaying last night in my head. The look in his eyes when I touched him, the way his body tensed under my fingertips. We were on the edge of something dangerous, something neither of us could take back. And I wasn't going to let him retreat now. That evening, I didn't bother with subtlety. I waited until I heard the familiar sound of his car pulling into the driveway, then positioned myself on the couch in the living room. I wore the same dress from the night before, but this time, I let one strap fall off my shoulder, exposing more skin than was appropriate for any stepdaughter. I heard the door open, the sound of his keys hitting the table, the soft shuffle of his footsteps growing louder. Then he appeared in the doorway. For a moment, he just stared. His eyes darkened as they raked over me, and I saw it, the exact moment he realized he couldn't run anymore. I patted the cushion beside me. Join me? He hesitated, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might crack. But then, slowly, he moved into the room and sat down, leaving just enough space between us to be polite, but not enough to escape. We sat in silence, the tension between us thick and suffocating. I pretended to watch the TV, but I could feel his body heat radiating beside me, could hear the unevenness of his breath. Then, ever so slightly, I shifted, letting my bare thigh brush against his. His entire body went rigid. I turned to him, my voice barely a whisper. Garrett. He didn't look at me. His eyes were glued to the screen, but I saw the pulse pounding in his neck, the way his hands clenched into fists on his lap. Don't you think we should talk about this? I continued, my lips dangerously close to his ear. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes blazing with something I couldn't quite name. There's nothing to talk about, he snapped, but his voice trembled. I reached out, placing my hand on his thigh, feeling the tension vibrating through him. I think there is. For a second, I thought he might give in. His eyes flickered to my lips, and I felt his body lean in, just slightly. But then, like a rubber band snapping back, he shot up from the couch, his face flushed and furious. Without a word, he stormed out of the room and up the stairs, his bedroom door slamming shut behind him. I sat there, my heart racing, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. He was at his breaking point. I could feel it. And soon, very soon, he wouldn't be able to resist anymore. Because I wasn't going to stop. I went to bed that night with a smile on my face, knowing that the next time we crossed paths, everything would change. And neither of us would be able to pretend anymore. The next day was supposed to change everything. I woke up to the soft chime of my phone, groggy and still tangled in the sheets from a restless night. The message on the screen made my heart skip a beat. Plans changed. I'll be home tonight. Love you. It was from Mom. For a brief second, I felt the tiniest flicker of hesitation. This was supposed to be our time, just me and Garrett, the tension between us simmering to a boil with no one around to interrupt. But now, she'd be back before sunset. That should have been my cue to stop, to reset, to act like nothing had ever happened. But I was too deep, too hooked on the thrill. Instead of backing off, I decided to push harder. The hours dragged, the anticipation gnawing at me with every tick of the clock. I spent the morning pacing the house, replaying every glance, every near touch, every moment when Garrett's resolve almost crumbled. I knew he was on the edge, and today I was going to make sure he fell. By the afternoon, I had a plan. I took a long, hot shower, letting the steam fog up the mirrors and my thoughts. When I stepped out, I wrapped the towel loosely around me, looser than necessary, letting it hang just enough to tease without revealing too much. My hair was still damp, clinging to my neck and shoulders as I made my way down the hall toward his office. I didn't bother knocking. Garrett was at his desk, pretending to be engrossed in something on his laptop, but the way his shoulders stiffened the moment I entered told me everything I needed to know. He knew I was there before he even looked up. I moved slowly, deliberately, pretending to scan the shelves for a book I wasn't actually looking for. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with all the words we weren't saying. Finally, I felt his eyes on me. I turned, catching him mid-glance, his gaze sliding from my exposed collarbone down to where the towel barely held together at my chest. Looking for something? His voice was rough, low, strained. I took a slow step toward him, letting the towel slip just a little lower on my hips. Maybe, I murmured, my eyes locked on his. But I don't think it's on the shelves. His jaw tightened. He closed his laptop with a snap, standing abruptly. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, maybe even reach for me. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his chest rose and fell with quick, uneven breaths. "Do you have something to say, Garrett?" I whispered, closing the gap between us. I could feel the heat radiating off his body, the magnetic pull drawing us closer. His eyes darkened, his lips parting like he was about to speak. The tension between us was electric, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear over it. But then, without a word, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. I stood there, my pulse still racing, my body buzzing from the near miss. He's scared, I thought. But not of me, of himself, of what he wanted, of what we both wanted. And I knew then, he wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. As evening crept closer, the house grew quieter. I could feel the countdown in the pit of my stomach. Mom would be home soon, and whatever this was between me and Garrett, it was now or never. I found him in the kitchen, standing by the sink, staring out the window like it could somehow save him from what was about to happen. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow through the glass, highlighting the tension etched into his face. I walked in, my towel long gone, replaced by a thin, silk robe that clung to my skin. The belt was tied loosely at my waist, the fabric parting slightly with each step I took. "Garrett," I said softly, letting his name hang in the air between us. He didn't turn around. I moved closer, my bare feet silent against the cool tile floor. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip tightened around the edge of the counter. "Why are you fighting this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I was standing right behind him now, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body. I reached out, my fingers brushing lightly against his arm. He flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. "You feel it too," I continued, my hand trailing up his arm to his shoulder. "Don't you?" For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw it. The raw, unfiltered desire, the fear, the guilt, all tangled together in a storm that mirrored my own. "You need to stop," he said, but his voice was hoarse, weak. Even he didn't believe his own words. I stepped closer, closing the small distance between us. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and shaky. My heart was pounding, but I didn't care. I was too far gone. "I don't want to stop," I whispered. For a heartbeat, we stood there, suspended in the tension. Then he did the last thing I expected. He stepped back. His eyes dropped from mine. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might shatter. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there, breathless and reeling. I didn't chase after him this time. I didn't need to, because I knew, deep down, he was already mine. And soon, very soon, he wouldn't be able to resist anymore. But just as I was about to savor the moment, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was Mom. "Just pulled into the driveway. See you in a minute." My stomach flipped. Not with guilt, because I felt none, but with anticipation. Because the game wasn't over yet. And the next move? It was going to be explosive. That evening, Mom came home. I tried to look calm, to act like everything was normal, but my heart was racing. The house suddenly felt smaller, suffocating under the weight of secrets I thought I had perfectly hidden. Garrett avoided my eyes as soon as Mom walked through the door, his posture stiff, his words clipped and cautious. But it wasn't him I was worried about. It was her. We all sat down for dinner at the table, like some picture-perfect family. The clinking of forks against plates filled the silence between us. I could feel Garrett's discomfort radiating off him like heat, his gaze fixed on his food. I smirked inwardly. He was still trying to play it cool, like nothing had happened. But every time our eyes almost met, he flinched. Mom, however, was more observant than I gave her credit for. She asked questions, small, innocent ones about my day, about Garrett's work, but her tone was different, sharper. There was an edge to her words, as if she was testing the air, sensing something wasn't right, and I could feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. After dinner, I excused myself, trying to maintain the same nonchalant attitude I'd perfected over the past few days. "I'm tired," I said, forcing a yawn. "I think I'll head to bed early." Garrett didn't say anything. He just stared at his plate, his knuckles white as he gripped his fork. Mom gave me a tight smile. "Good night, sweetheart." I made my way upstairs, my pulse pounding louder with every step. Once in my room, I left the door slightly ajar, an old habit at this point. But tonight, it wasn't about drawing Garrett, Indiana. It was about seeing what would happen next. I lay on my bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the rising anxiety gnawing in my stomach. I should have felt victorious. I'd played the game to perfection, after all. But something felt off. Then I heard it. Footsteps. But not Garrett's. Mom's. I froze, my thumb hovering over my screen as her steps moved past my door, down the hall. They stopped outside the study, Garrett's office. I strained to hear what was happening, but the house had gone deathly quiet. Minutes passed. Long, agonizing minutes. Then, suddenly, her voice. Sharp, loud, cutting through the silence like a knife. "What is this?" My heart stopped. I shot up from my bed, adrenaline surging through me as I bolted for the door. I barely had time to process what was happening before I was in the hallway, my bare feet hitting the cold floor as I ran towards the sound of her voice. When I reached the study, I skidded to a halt. There she was, standing in the middle of the room, her face pale with fury, her hands trembling as she held my phone. I didn't need to ask how she got it. I'd left it on the kitchen counter after dinner, distracted by the tension, too confident in my control of the situation. But there it was, in her hands, open to my messages with Savannah, where I'd detailed every little game I'd played with Garrett. Her eyes lifted from the screen to meet mine, and I had never seen her look at me like that before. "Is this some kind of joke?" Her voice was low now, but it was more terrifying than her shouting. Her hands gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Tell me this is a joke." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because what could I say? That it was just a game? That I didn't mean for it to go this far? Before I could even try to explain, her gaze shifted to Garrett. He stood in the corner of the room, silent, like a man waiting for his execution. His face was ashen, his eyes downcast, refusing to meet either of our gazes. He looked broken, but that didn't matter anymore. Mom turned back to me, her eyes blazing with betrayal. "Pack your things," she hissed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "And get out." I felt the floor drop beneath me. "What?" I whispered, my voice weak, the confidence I'd carried all week evaporating in an instant. "Now," she barked, her voice echoing off the walls. "I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." Garrett still hadn't moved. He didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent witness to the chaos unraveling around him. And in that moment, I realized something that hit harder than anything else. I had lost, not just the game, but everything. I left that night with nothing but a small bag of clothes and my shattered pride. As I stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of what had happened finally settled on my chest like a stone. I thought I was in control. I thought I was the one pulling the strings. But in the end, the joke was on me. Garrett had resisted, but I hadn't.